Chapter 14. Disaster in Kirtland. Although Joseph had returned from Salem without a chest of money, he was not exactly empty-handed. On behalf of the Kirtland mercantile firms, he had succeeded in New York City in borrowing $5,600 from Halstead, Haynes and Company. Later, Hiram Smith and Oliver Cowdery succeeded in obtaining credit in the East for about $60,000 worth of goods. These windfalls made it easy for him to borrow further on a smaller scale in the Kirtland area. Timothy Martindale loaned him $5,000, Winthrop Eaton $1,150, and the Bank of Geauga $3,000. But Joseph understood perfectly that continued borrowing only postponed the day of reckoning. While new loans meant a temporary respite, they added weight to an already frightening burden of debt. For 2 months he planned with his brethren how best to bring about its liquidation. The result of these deliberations was the Kirtland Safety Society Bank Company, organized in November 1836 with a capital stock of not less than $4 million, and directed by Sidney Rigdon as president and Joseph as cashier. The bank was expected to solve the problem of debts by the beguilingly simple expedient of stamping out new notes. Whenever possible, these notes were to be exchanged for hard money. At any other time than the mid-30s, such a plan would have been mad. The frontier had always favored the expansion of currency and any law designed to relieve the debtor class. Now, because of the frenetic land speculation, there was an enormous demand for money and a need for new banking facilities. All that was required to start a bank in the West was an unlimited amount of nerve and the necessary capital to pay the engraver and printer for making the notes. One bank in Ohio was chartered as an orphans' institute. Another was founded on the charter of a moribund library association, its total assets a remnant of dog-eared books. The number of authorized banks operating in the state had jumped from 11 in 1830 to 33 in 1836. Besides these, there were 9 unauthorized institutions also issuing money. Banknote circulation in 1836 was 70% greater than in 1835. There were at least 300 different kinds of authorized notes, to say nothing of the illegal bills and counterfeits, variously styled Yellow Dog, Smooth Monkey, Blue Pup, and Sick Indian. To the chaos of Ohio's banking system was now added Joseph's Safety Society. Subscriptions to the capital stock ranged from $1 to $500,000, most of the subscribers paying in Kirtland boomtown lots at 5 and 6 times normal value. According to the Painesville Telegraph, Joseph estimated his own land in Kirtland at $300,000 and stated that the whole capital stock of the bank was comprised in land lying within 2 square miles. The bank was said to have been established by a revelation from God, and rumor skipped through the town that the prophet had predicted that, like Aaron's rod, it would swallow up all other banks and grow and flourish and spread from the rivers to the ends of the earth and survive when all others should be laid in ruins. The Messenger and Advocate announced the organization of the bank in January 1837 and published an appeal which said in part, "We invite the brethren from abroad to call on us and take stock in our safety society, and we would remind them also of the sayings of Isaiah, 'Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from far, their silver and their gold, not their banknotes, with them, unto the name of the Lord thy God.'" On January 1, 1837, the same day that the printed banknotes arrived in Kirtland, there came the disconcerting news that the Ohio legislature had refused to incorporate the bank. Its operation thus became illegal in the same week that the publicity campaign was launched. Joseph explained to his people that because we're Mormons, the legislature raised some frivolous excuse on which they refused to grant us those banking privileges they so freely granted to others. Actually, only one new bank was allowed incorporation in this legislative session. The hard money wing of the Democratic Party, known as the No Bank Party, or Locofocos, had gained control and was determined to stop the increase of wildcat banks. Joseph, however, was too resourceful to be stopped by a formality. On January 2nd, the Kirtland Safety Society became the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company. The already engraved banknotes were stamped with the prefix anti before and the suffix ing after the word bank. By this device, Joseph expected to circumvent what he considered the prejudiced decision of the legislature and perhaps at the same time appeal to the fast-rising anti-banking sentiment. Now began the most exuberantly prosperous fortnight in Kirtland's history. Everyone's pockets bulged with bills. Local debts were paid off at once, and Joseph sent couriers east to pay the huge obligations of the Kirtland mercantile firms. With a good deal of fanfare, he announced further that a union had been formed with the Monroe Bank of Michigan Territory, Oliver Cowdery becoming the vice president. None of the men who remained faithful to Joseph ever publicly discussed the true financial situation of the Kirtland Bank, but several apostates at different times related an identical anecdote which suggests something of the quality of the bank's assets. Lining the shelves of the bank vault, they said, were many boxes, each marked $1,000. Actually, these boxes were filled with sand, lead, old iron, stone, and combustibles. But each had a top layer of bright 50-cent silver coins. Anyone suspicious of the bank's stability was allowed to lift and count the boxes. The effect of those boxes was like magic, said C.G. Webb. They created general confidence in the solidity of the bank and that beautiful paper money went like hotcakes. For about a month it was the best money in the country. Joseph's secretary, Warren Parrish, who was cashier for a short time, wrote in 1838, "I have been astonished to hear him declare that we had $60,000 in specie in our vaults and $600,000 at our command, when we had not to exceed $6,000 and could not command any more. Also that we had but about $10,000 of our bills in circulation when he, as cashier of that institution, knew that there was at least $150,000. The Painesville Republican, a paper generally friendly to the Mormons, remarked dryly on January 19, 1837, "With respect to the ability of the Kirtland Society to redeem their notes, we know nothing farther than what the report says. It is said they have a large amount of specie on hand and have the means of obtaining much more if necessary. If these facts be so, its circulation in some shape would be beneficial to the community." Cleveland merchants, alarmed by the newspaper insinuations, began to refuse the notes, though not before about $36,000 worth had been passed in the city. Merchants in Buffalo and New York scorned them from the beginning, and no bank anywhere would touch them. Soon the bills were streaming back into Kirtland. Joseph redeemed a good number before he realized that the run on the bank was about to ruin him. On January 27, less than a month after the bank's opening, the Painesville Telegraph reported that he had shut up shop, saying he would not redeem another dollar except with land. Everyone possessing Kirtland bank bills now tried desperately to get rid of them. By February 1, they were selling for 12 1/2 cents to the dollar. Smith and Rigdon resigned, and F.G. Williams and Warren Parrish took over the offices of president and cashier in a final effort to salvage something from the wreckage. From its beginning, the bank had been operating illegally. A state law fixed the penalty for such an offense at $1,000 and guaranteed informers a share of the fine. It was inevitable that one of the prophet's enemies should set the law upon him, and on February 8 a writ was sworn out by Samuel D. Rounds. When the court convened on 24 March, Joseph's lawyers tried to prove that the statute had not been in force at the time of the bank's organization, but they lost the case and Joseph was ordered to pay a $1,000 penalty and costs. If the bank needed a final blow to shatter what little prestige it still had held among the faithful, it received it when Warren Parrish resigned as cashier, left the church, and began openly to describe the banking methods of the prophet. Parrish was later accused of absconding with $25,000, but if he took the sum, it must have been worthless banknotes, since that amount of specie in the vaults would have saved the bank, at least during Joseph's term as cashier. May brought disaster to the whole country. Within a single month, 800 banks containing $120 million in deposits suspended operations. The panic of 1837 had arrived, and a nation gone loco over land settled down to its state of retribution. The Kirtland Bank, which had collapsed 4 months before the panic began, actually continued issuing notes until June. Then on June 29, Rigdon was brought to court for making spurious money, and the practice was finally stopped. It was not until August, however, that Joseph formally renounced the bank in the Messenger and Advocate and warned his people against accepting the bank notes. Oliver Cowdery's Bank of Monroe teetered on the brink of disaster until the last week in March, when, with only $1,026 left in specie, it suspended payment for 60 days. The Monroe Times, which published the financial statement, concluded manfully, "It is only necessary to caution the holders of the bills not to throw them away, but be assured the bank will not go down." The rise and fall of the bank brought very little actual change to Kirtland's economy. The disaster was as much an illusion as the prosperity had been. Warren Parrish recognized this when he wrote in March 8, 1838, "Knowing their extreme poverty when they commenced in this Mormon speculation, I have been not a little surprised to hear them assert that they were worth from $300,000 to $400,000 each, and in less than 90 days after became insolvent, without any change in their business affairs." Some of the saints lost very real, though modest, fortunes, but eventually they washed the slate clean of grievances and refused to sully their journals with complaints. Joseph's grammar teacher, who'd become disaffected many years later, told W. Will that he had lost $2,500. "I got for my money the blessing of the Lord," he said, "and the assurance that by and by the notes of that bank would be the best money in the country." The legend of Joseph's prophecy that someday the banknotes would be as good as gold never died down. Years later, Brigham Young collected some of the gold dust that was coming into Salt Lake from the goldfields of California, manufactured a supply of coins, and ordered that a pack of Kirtland bills he had carried west with him be issued on par with the gold. Joseph thus found at least one man who could make his prophecies come true. The toppling of the Kirtland Bank loosed a hornet's nest. Creditors swarmed in upon Joseph armed with threats and warrants. He was terribly in debt. There is no way of knowing exactly how much he and his leading elders had borrowed, since the loyal Mormons left no itemized account of their own claims. But the local non-Mormon creditors whom he could not repay brought a series of suits against the prophet, which the Geauga County Court duly recorded. These records tell a story of trouble that would have demolished the prestige and broken the spirit of a lesser man. 13 suits were brought against him between June 1837 and April 1839 to collect sums totaling nearly $25,000. The damages asked amounted to almost $35,000. He was arrested 7 times in 4 months, and his followers managed heroically to raise the $38,428 required for bail. Of the 13 suits, only 6 were settled out of court, about 12,000 of the 25,000. In the other 7, the creditors were either awarded damages or won them by default. Joseph had many additional debts that never resulted in court action. Some years later, he compiled a list of still outstanding Kirtland loans, which amounted to more than $33,000. If one adds to these the 2 great loans of $30,000 and $60,000 borrowed in New York and Buffalo 1836, it would seem that the Mormon leaders owed to non-Mormon individuals and firms well over $150,000. This indebtedness hung over the prophet's head when he faced his church in conference in April 1837. "Large contracts have been entered into lands for on all sides," he said, "where our enemies have signed away their rights. We are indebted to them, but our brethren abroad have only to come up with their money, take these contracts, relieve their brethren from the pecuniary embarrassments under which they now labor, and procure for themselves a peaceable place of rest among us." He closed with what the church newspaper described as a prophecy. "This place must be built up, and will be built up, and every brother that will take hold and help secure and discharge these contracts shall be rich." It was a vain appeal and an unhappy promise. One by one the weak in faith left the ranks. Sylvester Smith, one of the first to apostatize, spread the poison of his disillusionment everywhere. At least 6 of the 12 apostles were in open rebellion, and Parley Pratt, whose rhapsodic eloquence had brought hundreds into the church, was even threatening to bring suit against the prophet. Pratt wrote a letter to Joseph in May 23, 1837, which said in part, "And now, dear brother, if you are still determined to pursue this wicked course until you yourself and the church shall sink down to hell, I beseech you at least to have mercy on me and my family, and others who are bound with me to those lots of land which you sold to me at an extortionary price of $2,000, which never cost you $100. For if it stands against me, it will ruin me and my helpless family, as well as those bound with me. For yesterday, President Rigdon came to me and informed me that you had drawn the money from the bank on the obligations which you held against me, and that you had left it to the mercy of the bank and could not help whatever course they might take to collect it, notwithstanding the most sacred promises on your part that I should not be injured by those writings. I offered him the 3 lots for the writings, but he wanted my house and home also. Now, dear brother, will you take those lots and give me up the writings and pay me the $75 which I paid you on the same? Or will you take advantage of your neighbor because he is in your power? If not, I shall be under the painful necessity of preferring charges against you for extortion, covetousness, and taking advantage of your brother by an undue religious influence, such as saying it was the will of God that lands should bear with such a price, and many other prophesyings, preachings, and statements of a like nature." Joseph threatened to excommunicate any saint who brought suit against a brother in the church, and ordered Pratt to trial before the High Council on May 29. but the council itself was racked with schism, and the meeting broke up in disorder. Meanwhile, Grandison Newell, the most bellicose anti-Mormon in Ohio, who had gleefully watched the church's financial structure collapse, determined to smash Joseph's personal prestige forever. He wrote open letters to the Painesville Telegraph on May 16 and 26, accusing the prophet of inciting two Mormons named Denton and Davis to kill him so that he would not proceed against the bank. Desperately shaken by this climax to 4 months of continuing calamity, Joseph wrote in his journal, "It seemed as though the powers of earth and hell were combining their influence in an especial manner to overthrow the church at once and make a final end." Heber Kimball was probably not exaggerating much when he said at this time there were not 20 persons on earth that declare that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. Since Grandison Newell was known publicly as the Mormon persecutor, many suspected that his suit against the prophet was concocted out of pure malice. When the court convened early in June, it was clear he had no case, and few were surprised when the judge dismissed the suit for want of evidence. The Newell attack served to win Joseph a good deal of sympathy from his own people. Apostles T.B. Marsh and Orson Hyde, who had been sharply critical of the banking failure, confessed their sins and begged forgiveness. Even Pratt was reconciled, although he refused to stay in Kirtland where the air was still fetid with the breath of slander, and asked to be sent east where he could clear his blood of acrimony by preaching to the godless. Joseph now realized that Kirtland must somehow be cleared of his best elders until the banking fiasco could be forgotten and the debts discharged or deferred. The best way to ensure the loyalty of his men was to send them on missions, where they could lose the petty grievances in preaching the purity of the gospel. He decided, therefore, to establish a mission in England. This was a plan he had contemplated ever since seeing the phenomenal success of the Canadian mission. Many converts in the Toronto area were urging that men be sent to England to preach to their relatives. On June 1, 1837, Joseph appointed the big, sloping-shouldered Heber Kimball to head a missionary group. With him went the repentant-eyed and unable young Willard Richards. The English mission was thus born of disaster, and not even in his most extravagant daydreams could the prophet have envisioned its success. As the summer advanced, bringing the full measure of the panic to the west, Joseph began to win back more of the ground he had lost. Many who had been ready to apostatize when the Kirtland Bank failed reconsidered when the banks shut their doors everywhere. With the whole financial structure of the nation collapsing, Joseph's speculation now looked more like an indiscretion than grand larceny. Many a saint came to accept the dignified apology offered in July by the Messenger and Advocate. We believe that banking or financiering is as much a regular science, trade, or business as those of law, physic, or divinity, and that a man may be an eminent civilian. We know nothing of consequence of the principle of medicine. He may be a celebrated divine, and be no mechanic and no financier, and be as liable to fail in the management of a bank as he would in constructing a balloon or the mechanism of a watch. We are not prepared in our feelings to censure any man. In mid-July, Joseph left on a 5-week missionary tour to Canada, hoping that in his absence the enmity against him would be still further dissipated. But he returned, refreshed and invigorated, to find that the church had split in two. The faction opposing him had rallied around a young girl who claimed to be a seeress by virtue of a black stone in which she read the future. David Whitmer, Martin Harris, and Oliver Cowdery, whose faith in seer stones had not diminished when Joseph stopped using them, pledged their loyalty. And F.G. Williams, formerly Joseph's first counselor, became her scribe. Patterning herself after the Shakers, the new prophetess would dance herself into a state of exhaustion before her followers, fall upon the floor, and burst forth with revelations. It was disheartening to Joseph to see his prized 3 Book of Mormon witnesses apparently ready to witness still another dispensation, but before long he effectively silenced the dancing seeress. Cowdery and Whitmer came back into the fold half contrite, half suspicious, and shortly thereafter went off to Missouri. Only Martin Harris, whose wagging tongue had become unbearable, was cut off from the church. Joseph now felt free to test the loyalty of his saints in a conference, and was once more sustained as president of the church by unanimous vote. This triumph was illusory and short-lived. With the mercantile firms bankrupt and the steam mill silent, the land value sinking to an appalling low, Kirtland was fast disintegrating. Those saints who had means were moving to Missouri, not only because it spelled Zion, but also because it was west, in which direction hope in America has always bent. Joseph, in company with Sidney Rigdon, left for a visit to Missouri shortly after his return from Canada. His departure was doubtless hastened by the fact that 6 suits against him to asking damages totaling $6,100 were pending in Chardon, and court was due to convene on October 24. It was impossible for him to meet these debts. He had sent out men in groups of 8 from Kirtland to gather money to save the church, but he could not count upon their return for another 3 months. During Joseph's 2-month absence in Missouri, the church in Kirtland went completely to pieces. After brawling in the temple with members still loyal to the prophet, the dissenters set up a church of their own. They deluged the faithful with lawsuits, forcing many elders, including Brigham Young, to flee to Missouri to escape arrest. After the fracas in the temple, Joseph Smith's father and 16 others were arrested on a charge of riot, but the judge dismissed the case on the ground that there was no cause for action. Next, the dissenters tried to secure the printing press with its 800 copies of the Book of Mormon, which had fallen into the hands of Grandison Newell. At this stage of affairs, Joseph returned from Missouri. He called for a public trial in the temple, determined that the sores that had so long been festering on the body of the church must be hacked out without mercy. The dissenters arrived in force. L. E. Miller, who was present, related afterward that Joseph came into the gathering with a resolution and a courage that the situation seemed to demand, and carried himself as one who felt that his soul and being had found themselves set firmly on the rock, while all else was but the shifting of sand or the swaying of seeds in the summer wind. He had made a resolute, determined battle. Then Rigdon took the stand. He was half sick and had to be supported to the pulpit, but it was a sickness born partly of hatred and despair, and once he began his denunciation, he found unexpected reserves of energy and vitriol. For 7 years he had watched the church gathering power, drawing much of its strength from the Baptists and Campbellites, whose leaders in the past had chosen to scorn him. He looked upon the glory of the church as a peculiarly personal triumph. Mormonism, he had written, has puked the Campbellites effectively. No emetic could do so half so well. Having little social vision and being completely incapable of understanding the economic forces that contributed to Kirtland's financial chaos, he had become a witch hunter and now accused the dissenters of a long catalog of crimes, which included lying, stealing, adultery, counterfeiting, and swindling. His savage attack rose in a crescendo of violent epithets that stunned the saints. Finally, when his energy was spent, he let himself be helped down a long aisle to the entrance, and the congregation sat in silence while the temple doors closed behind him. There followed a bitter fight, as charges and countercharges were hurled back and forth. Joseph completely lost control. Shouting above the din, he called for an end to debate and a vote on the excommunications. "Yes," yelled the dissenter, "you would cut a man's head off and hear him afterward." The meeting finally broke up, and Joseph left the temple conscious that he had lost, probably forever, what had been 7 years in the building. Shortly after, when the word came that Grandison Newell had secured a warrant for his arrest on the charge of banking fraud, Joseph knew that this was the finish and fled in the night with Rigdon, his horse turned toward Zion. After their prophet's disappearance, the dissenters seized the temple, and within the walls that had been so recently resounded with hymns to his glory, they passed resolutions proclaiming his depravity. On the night of 1516 January, 3 days after Joseph's flight, the building housing the printing press caught fire and burned to the ground. Warren Parrish accused Joseph of being responsible for the incendiarism, saying that he had done it to prevent its printing matter against him, and also to fulfill a prophecy that God would destroy Kirtland by fire for its wickedness. Parrish by this time had come to believe the worst of Joseph and Rigdon, whom he had once looked to as gods. "I believe them to be confirmed infidels," he wrote, "who have not a fear for God before their eyes. They lie by revelation, run away by revelation, and if they do not mend their ways, I fear they will at last be damned by revelation."